Once again, welcome to ITSE 1345 triggers. Triggers is one of those things where if a condition occurs, you will take action. Now, there are actually different conditions for these triggers. They can occur when a condition exists before action is taken. They can occur after a condition. They can occur before and after a condition. When you're working with triggers, the technical name that Oracle uses, or the technical name that is used, is fired. So when a condition occurs, action will happen. That is called fired or firing. So you fire a trigger based on a condition or an event. Now, let's go back to the structure of an operating system. Remember that there is system, and then there's the database. Sys creates system, system creates a database, and this is how you propagate the other ones. Now, trigger is a unique item in that it's actually stored outside the database, somewhere in the twilight zone system. In that what it does, it allows you to take action not only on the database, but it allows you to actually turn the machine off, turn the machine on, do certain things that these are actions that sometimes cannot be taken from when you're working internal to an operation. So most of the things we've talked to date have been those items that you work with when you're internal to the program, internal to the database, internal to the process. The trigger is one of those items that can actually take action outside that event. We really haven't talked about how do you start a database? How do you turn off a database? How do you take certain actions to a database? Because everything we've talked up to date has been within, we have an existing database, we assume it's turned on, we assume we're using it, and we're taking recursive action, repetitive action on that data. We really haven't talked about, well, how do you start the machine to begin with? Now, initially, when I began, in the morning when I would come to work, it took me a good half hour to 45 minutes to turn the machine on and go to all the incremental steps that are required to get to the point where you actually have the database up and running. And conversely, in the afternoon when I turned the database off, I would send an email around 4:30, says, by the way, be sure to clean up your work because I got to turn the machine off. And then around 4:45, I'd say, by the way, I'm going to start shutting you guys off. And then at 5 o'clock, I had to make sure. So between 4:45 and 5 o'clock, I systematically, sequentially, made sure everybody was off. So by 5 o'clock, I could start doing the shutdown. And it was a very tedious manual process because it was really not automated. Well, once again, as technology has advanced, they now have these processes that are a lot more succinct, and you push a button, it gets done. Instead of having to manually do all the steps, they now have these processes where you hit the button and it gets done. And that is the scary part. Before, when everything was done manually, you could, as you were doing these steps, you could understand what you were doing. And, if you got to a point where you didn't like it, well, you could back up or do something. There was a transitional issue where if you got to a point that you weren't comfortable with, you didn't have to proceed. Well, these new automated systems that once you push the trigger, it's a done deal, and you have to make sure that everything's right. Which is why I was telling you earlier that when you get it to the trigger event, sometimes there's no recursive nature to that. It's a one-way street, so you got to make sure it's done right. Otherwise, you're going to be in real trouble. Now, so we can start up, or we could shut down. And understanding that a lot of the modification to a database has to occur when the database is turned off. It's like trying to overhaul an engine while it's running. You really can't overhaul the engine. You got to turn it off before you can work on it. Well, the trigger is that mechanism that allows you to turn the machine off, allows you to modify it, allows you to turn it back on and reinitialize everything. So the trigger can actually force everybody off, not turn the database off, but log everybody off, give you sole control, allow you to make the modifications, and then release the database back to users. In the case that I just said, there are two items that you should be familiar with, which are DML events and DDL events. And that is what I'm alluding to, where you have the ability to do updates or inserts or deletes. You have the ability to do subsequent events. You remember I went back and I told you about that event where, you know, you have the IRS year and the business year. The IRS is January to December, and the business year maybe be October to September. Well, if you get to that point at the end of September where you're going to create the new business year, you have to have a process that would go back in there and recreate all the events you would need for the new year. So a trigger would be that item that would be used to create, alter, drop, revoke stuff. Getting back to that inconsistent state that I was talking about. When you're dealing with triggers and you do come across an inconsistent state, the technical name is mutating tables. That is where you have created a process, a cascade process, where somehow or another in this cascade process of all the items you have to address and work with, one of them did not work right. So you now have, you had 10 items you had to do and 9 got, and let's go back to the fact that, remember that you may have other users that are accessing the database. So at the moment you're using a trigger, for whatever reason, another user has inadvertently resulted in a condition where one of the tables is hanging up. Then you have this issue where not the task got completed, but not all the elements in that task were accomplished. And that's one of the issues that you have to address. So you have the system level events, which turn on and off, and you have the user level events. Now, let's go back and talk about a user. The user, what is a user? A user is anything that consumes kind of resources. Understand that if we say a procedure is a user, a function is a user, or a cursor is a user, and you're working within a trigger, these user events have to be managed and structured. And that, okay, the way you get around this item of managing is that you have to develop a sequence of events to occur. And this is called firing order. Now, I haven't talked about the structure. I've talked about the scenario of the structure, but I haven't talked about the structure. Now, in the structure, once again, you have the header and you have the body. Okay? The interesting thing about a trigger is that, for the most part, it does not have any programming capabilities. What it does, it has, basically you have a list of programs and you have what the programs do. The trigger is basically, it says, if this happens, so what you're saying, if this happens, do this. That's basically what the trigger does. If you have a condition, take this action. Now, when you say if this happens, this is where you have a lot of the if, thens, and case, and all kinds of stuff, because you have to kind of permutate that event. So you have, if this condition exists, or this event happens, or whatever occurs, take this action. You have, if this happens, you can do it once again before. You have before and after, and then you have after. Now, the before and after, I guess the easiest way is before, during, and after is the easiest way to say it. So you have before activity, during activity, and after activity that you can use. When you're creating this structure, over here, you have to tell it, part of this process, if this occurs, part of the definition is you have to tell it if this event is designed to occur before an action, during an action, before, after, or after an action. Before, after, and after in the header definition. Also, remember that when you do table modification or something, you can actually do a whole record, or you can do one column or one field in this record. So as you're doing this, you have to kind of tell them whether the action is going to be at a row event or at a statement event. So let's see, the trigger does the system level event. It does the user level event. You have to be cognizant of the fact that you have, because you're working kind of outside the database, not within the database, that you can have mutating tables. And one of the ways you get around this mutating table is to have the firing order. So one of the deals in this here is the sequence that occurs. You have to be sure that if this occurs, the sequence is very critical to avoid the issue where you leave something happening, because you have to make sure that these things are structured in the right sequence. That way, one turns off before the other one turns on. You don't want to have them fighting each other trying to get things done. Once again, Oracle considers this stuff a user. If it considers it a user, sometimes you have to give whatever activity is happening the permission to take action. So you have to grant an action to this process. So you could say, I will grant this procedure the ability to update, insert, or delete. You could also grant the process to drop a table. So since this is actually the scenario that's acting on the database, not within the database, since it's acting on the database, you can drop, you can create, you can update, you can append, because you're acting outside on the actual database. You're not working within the database itself. So that's the difference between the DDL and the DML. One works within the database, modifying the data, working with the data. The other works with the structure of the database. And once again, if you're working with a structure, you got to make sure it's turned off or not really in action so you can get that accomplished. So if you're going to create a table, if you're going to alter a table, if you're going to drop a table, understand that you do have to give permission to that process to take action. And within the primary user, you would have subsequent users, and you would have to grant the authority privilege of those subsequent users. And I'm saying a procedure, a function, a cursor would be a user to the database, and you have to grant the ability of that item to take action. For the most part, I think that summarizes Chapter 9.